Hello everyone, dear friends. My name is Ignat Alexey. I am a master's student of the Russian University of Sports. Today I am visiting Dmitry Ivanovich Sechin. We are located on the territory of the Russian University of Sports. Dmitry Ivanovich is a candidate of biological sciences, a lecturer at the Department of Biochemistry and Bioenergetics of Sports, and is also the head of the Bioenergetics Laboratory of the Russian University of Sports. So, where are we again? We are in the premises of the Cathedral Laboratory. The laboratory is devoted to the study of energy processes mainly in athletes. So, it would be interesting for me today, Dmitry, to ask you such a question. Why study physical education and energy and in general all people who want to do sports and physical education? The question is clear. Initially, it is worth proceeding from the fact that energy is a scientific direction that studies various energy transformations. That is, if we have considered the general energy, then it is in the general context. If it were human energy, then in relation to the human body. Accordingly, within the framework of this scientific direction, the described energy transformations associated with ensuring the possibility of restoring the body, its growth, the use of energy sources within the framework of performing any physical work and, accordingly, knowledge from the field of human bioenergetics and bioenergetics of sports can be used by both athletes and athletes with those prices to try to justify energy spending which a person carries out directly as part of the training process, to read the amount of energy that has been spent and try to contribute to accelerating recovery after the same loads. Bioenergetic expenses are directly related to the fact that the body subsequently needs to restore the energy balance, which is disrupted due to the fact that a person performs any physical activity. Even staying at rest causes a certain kind of energy expenditure, which is associated with maintaining the constancy of the body's homeostasis and restoring its structure, if necessary. Therefore, the human body always has energy needs, and it is advisable to have at least some basic ideas about energy characteristics not only for athletes, but also for athletes. This way they will be able to more accurately understand the specifics of the training process that they are involved in. They will also be able to somehow help optimize the recovery of the body after training loads of a certain orientation. In simple words, this is the study of our energy expenditure during physical activity and its recovery. That is this what the energy industry is handing over for, or what? This is one of the areas that is considered within the framework of human energy and sports energy. If we talk about what is more interesting for bioenergetics, then it is appropriate to say that there are a number of bioenergetic processes that have their own specific cardinal differences. And it is precisely on these differences and the differentiation of these mechanisms of energy supply that the main provisions on bioenergetics of sports are concentrated at this moment in time. Accordingly, there are two, so to speak, strengthened energy mechanisms. The first mechanism is aero, that is, it is the formation of energy with the presence of oxygen in the intracellular medium and also releases anaerobic, that is, those bioenergetic processes that do not require the local presence of oxygen for their activation. They are radically different from each other. They are similar only in the sense that they produce energy, and in other aspects they differ somewhat. Here, if we differentiate all this in more detail, then we can say that there are three main mechanisms of energy supply. It's aerobic. This is assumed to be due to the action of, so to speak, binarg substrates within the tricarboxylic acid cycle, which implies the subsequent cleavage of hydrogen from the oxidized substance and its transfer with the help of special oxygen carriers, as a result of which energy is formed in the human body. The second mechanism is glycolysis. With glycosis, there are several nuances related to the fact that it has an aerobic phase and an anaerobic phase. This is always the glycosine of the anaerobic phase, but in general, so to speak, it is more considered in sports from the point of view of the anaerobic component, that is, the component when, according to the results of performing high-power muscle work, lactic acid or lactate accumulates. And the third biological mechanism that comes into the field of view of the volume of sports energy is the creatine phosphate mechanism of energy supply. Just the same, it is predominant in the speed of power sports, in weightlifting and other sports in which it is necessary to demonstrate a sufficiently large power of motor actions. At the same time, An important key aspect of all these three mechanisms of energy supply is that they are aimed at ensuring the synthesis of adenosine triphosphoric acid, abbreviated ATP, because only at the expense of ATP can the body ensure the performance of muscle work. That's it, got it. Physical education classes and optimal psycho-physiological functioning of a person. That is, as I understand it, physical education affects the optimal psychological functioning of a person. It is appropriate to note here that physical education classes can affect the psychophysiological functions of a person in a fairly wide range. We can talk about both a positive context and a negative context. This is all due primarily to the fact that often the dosage of physical activity within the framework of some specialized classes that people choose for themselves or organize independently does not fall under the criterion of optimal loads. We all know perfectly well that there are conditions such as overexertion, overtraining and similar conditions that are more associated with athletes, but, unfortunately, in our country there are quite a large number of the same athletes who are engaged in some kind of athleticism somewhere in gyms. And, as a rule, this category of persons is characterized by a high probability of occurrence of these conditions. This is directly related to the fact that a person has changes in his psychophysiological functions. This can manifest itself in, so to say, prolonged, so to say, episodes of human fatigue within working hours. This can manifest itself in a violation of circadian rhythms, when a person's sleep and wakefulness regime is disrupted, and many, many similar, say, aspects of modern human life. This is primarily due to the fact that people, as a rule, are not very serious about issues related to the dosage of training effects. Again, here it is possible to proceed from bioenergetics, to determine individually the optimal energy expenditure when performing certain exercises, which will subsequently give a so-called complex effect not only in terms of energy, but also in terms of launching some adaptive changes to the load that a person would like to see for himself. At the same time, it is also appropriate to mention such an important fact that, as a rule, persons engaged in physical culture are persons of working age and they combine these physical culture classes directly with the performance of their work duties, that is, they do their work somewhere in parallel, for which they receive money and in parallel they need to conduct some kind of satisfying their lifestyle. And there may be some contradictions here. If a person engaged in physical culture comes, for example, to a gym or to some section and so on and wants to acquire some rather serious results in this direction, which he is engaged in. That is, there is a high probability that a person will resort to using sufficiently high intensity and high volume training loads. Subsequently, this can lead to the emergence of overstrain not before recovery in everything else, which is why the same psychophysiological functions, due to which a person carries out his main work activity, they will be somewhat aggravated due to the fact that the body is, so to speak, in a state of under-recovery. Therefore, it is advisable for a person to study at least some basic features of the functioning of his own body. First, of course, this should happen at the level of physiology, that is, individual physiological systems. Subsequently, a person can deepen his knowledge directly in the direction of some biochemical, bioenergetic patterns, so that he can intuitively understand that I will not perform these loads for the simple reason that they are not relevant to my current functional state. If I do them now, it will be hard for me to work tomorrow, because I will not finish. Therefore, it is necessary to proceed primarily from these features. In your opinion, is the psychophysiological state optimal? That is, here is a person going to do sports or physical education. That is, he should understand that, roughly speaking, I have an ideal condition right now. Is there any such state that you can feel or interpret yourself? The question is actually very complicated, because here you can make a reference to another term. It is called the functional state. Functionally. So let's say there is simply no scientific and reasonable definition of this term, because it is the widest possible definition, which includes a huge number of processes that take place in the body and so on. Therefore, here, for sure, for people who are engaged in physical culture, it is necessary to rely on some subjective feelings that they have, firstly, in everyday life, and secondly, during the performance of their work duties and directly during training. Here, an important criterion for the effectiveness of physical exertion will be that you will have optimal sleep, you will observe the regime, go to bed at the same time, wake up at the same time, and you have an optimal appetite, that is, you, for example, want to have breakfast, you are waiting for lunch, you are doing some snacks, for example, you want, so to speak, to eat food, plus, respectively, a normal dinner and so on. That is, if you have optimal eating behavior, optimal sleep mode and you combine all this with physical activity, everything is probably fine and somehow it makes no sense to modernize this entire system of your training. And the other side of all this is that, as a rule, the performance of work duties by a modern person is associated with conditions of hypodermia, sedentary, that is, a sedentary lifestyle, and often there is also a violation of food digestion, due to the fact that a person cannot, in view of fulfilling his work duties, so to speak, perform a certain amount meals that would be directly optimal for him. And it turns out that in order to prevent this inactivity and everything related to it, it is advisable for a person to add some specific types of physical activity. As a rule, these approaches have already been described in sufficient detail, they are publicly available, posted on the internet, and so on. But in general, they boil down to the fact that it is necessary for a person to provide the opportunity to perform multi-joint exercises, which will be performed in the so-called aerobic energy regime, which involves just the same increase in heart rate, increased blood microcirculation in those tissues that are little involved in the conditions when a person conducts his professional activity. In this way, you can maintain the optimal physiological state of your body, which will undoubtedly bring some effects to psycho-physiological functions, because they are also tied to the psycho-physiological functions of energy features, that is, the current balance of energy, how it is restored, and so on. At the same time, there are some mechanisms of regulation of these psycho-physiological functions, which are primarily regulated by a set of neurotransmitters or so-called neurohormones. Accordingly, physical activity itself also requires the use of these neurotransmitters, the same neurohormones, and at the same time the energy resource of the central nervous system is consumed. Thus, physical activity is also a kind of load on the central nervous system for the human body. And as we know, such loads cause a number of adaptive changes as a result of their implementation, which are associated with an improvement in energy metabolism, an improvement in plastic metabolism. And thus, these very physical activities, if we consider them as such an effective effect on the central nervous system, allows us to increase the energy efficiency of the central nervous system. Plus many people notice subjective. For my subjective feelings, I notice that there is an increase in stress, stability, and all others. It affects all life days, which are quite important in the life of a modern person. So you said about biochemistry, and that's just what I have a question for you. Why are you studying biochemistry? For sports? Well, it is clear that you are studying as part of your training and your, so to speak, activities. But it is, if we offer to study the biochemistry of athletes to a physical education student, he should understand why, as it were. And what would your opinion be, why should it be studied? The basis, in principle, is that behind this biochemistry, bioenergetics, there is the fact that a person can consider programs of their own training sessions. If this person trains someone, he can look at the programs that are implemented for these people and make some conclusions in the sense that a certain type of loads develops individual bioenergetic systems, a certain type of loads accelerate certain biochemical reactions. And thus, the title of these biochemicals or energy allows you to more accurately and more correctly manage the processes that occur in the human body. Because if we now look at the sport of the highest achievements and take any sports training programs for highly qualified athletes, if a specialist looks at these armor, they can see absolutely logical patterns associated with the fact that training has a certain bioenergetic orientation, plus they have a certain biochemical justification. And thus, Answering the question why athletes of various levels should have an idea about these patterns, which we are talking about now, is, so to speak, increasing your awareness of how your body functions. You will understand him better. You will perceive some emerging self-perceptions, subjective sensations somewhat differently, because you will know what is the cause of these sensations. It doesn't matter, these are past sensations, these are pleasant sensations, and so on. That is, in this way you take most of your life under your own control. That is, it's like after the training process. Yes, we understand the recovery processes, this is also biochemistry. Before the training, the moment of the training process. Of course, got it. See if that's also within the scope of this question. Is it possible to tell the Krebs cycle to the child so that he understands? Quite an interesting question. Talking about the cycle, it is quite difficult for even adults to understand all these patterns, but if we go down to the theses and try to form a general idea about this mechanism, within which energy increases, then we can say that this is a set of enzymatic reactions that occur directly in the mitochondria. For this cycle, a universalized substance is used, which subsequently gives hydrogen for the formation of energy and, so to speak, requires oxygen for its functioning. But if we tell this to a child, how could we explain it to him? That is primitive. That is, look, and here you are doing, roughly speaking, began to straighten out by living, right? Well, there is a child who is not learning to walk on the run, namely, who has already gone to sports there, a gymnast. And so the gymnast's children need to be explained so that they understand that the moment of the exercise, they have this situation. That is it possible to somehow try to draw with your finger like this? If we are talking in relation to physical activity, that is, to try to justify how the tricarboxylic acid cycle or the Krebs cycle is involved in performing physical exercises, then, firstly, we must proceed from the fact that the Krebs cycle always functions with us. Energy supply. And it turns out that when a person begins to perform some kind of low-intensity warm-up, what happens in the first place for a person? Imagine that you start running. At what speed? What effects do you have in your body? We begin to breathe purity, cleanliness. Such an interesting indicator as minutes per volume of blood circulation increases. These are all adaptive, urgent adaptive changes. They are grouped under the so-called oxygen transport system. It includes the respiratory system, the cardiovascular system, the blood system. And it turns out that the activation of this system leads to the fact that more oxygen is delivered directly to the working muscles. And the question arises, what is this oxygen intended for, which is delivered directly to the working muscles in increased volumes when you start, say, some physical exercises? There is, in principle, quite simple for the simple reason that the local demand in terms of oxygen increases. That is, in order to ensure the performance of physical work of the required power, locally there is an acceleration of the processes of energy formation, that is, 3 syntheses of ATP. And if you do not perform high-power work, then, as a rule, just the same aerobic resource is enough for this. That is, it turns out that, relatively speaking, carbohydrates and fatty acids can fall into this cycle of tricarbonic acids. They, roughly speaking, line themselves up and get into this cycle of 3 carboxylic acids when additional oxygen comes directly to the active one. That is, there should be such an association. If you start doing something active in terms of physical actions that does not correlate with your state of rest, you will have an activation of aerobic mechanisms, which is primarily due to the acceleration of the same tricarbon cycle, an increase in the amount of non-resources that enter it, namely the amount of oxygen that gets into it. That is, if you sum it up like this, in ordinary life, of course, it always happens, but we can't feel it like that. We have enough to absorb. That is, usually. But if I explain to the child, look, you will now jump into a gymnastic tournament there, begin to perform exercises, everything in this system increases, that is, the depth of breathing increases, the purity of breathing. That is, at this moment they can understand that these processes will be sent to them and it will be clearer for them. That is about it. Relatively speaking. Well, relatively speaking, because if we explain to a child who, as it were, does not feel changes just in ordinary life, yes, it can no longer be. Yes, he cannot relate it with his own feelings, and not very native associations will just give some knowledge with active representations. Yes, that is, it is desirable, of course, to do it in practice. That's it, got it. One more question. Mitochondria and their importance for health. That is, what do you think is the significance of mitochondria unhealthiness? Here it is necessary to proceed from the fact that mitochondria are, in principle, the energy station of the cell, and at the expense of the mitochondrium we just get energy in order to exist, be installed, perform some kind of physical activity and so on. Therefore, they are certainly important, but there is a certain point, which is that our body functions economically enough and it is absolutely impractical for it to keep any excess of internal organelles and, let's say, the same energy resources. Therefore, an organism, a healthy organism that does not have any pathological conditions or deviations in the state of health, as a rule, will be characterized by the optimal number of mitochondria that are needed specifically for this person. Here everything will rest on the mode of motor activity with a person. Because if a person leads a sedentary lifestyle, sedentary and characteristic of inactivity, and so on, then the question of mitochondria will be raised from those positions, and whether the number of mitochondria will decrease and whether their functionality will decrease. Not to mention some enzymatic systems that are localized in these mitochondria. And such a situation is increasing that if we even correlate this situation, which I have just voiced with some experience, to observing our environment, we can notice that those people who are sedentary, they are less hardy, they develop shortness of breath faster and everything else. This is due to the fact that not only at the mitochondrial level, some processes differ somewhat from the norm of health and so on, but also a number of other body systems, too. Here we must say that it is possible for some people to engage in aerobic exercise in order to somehow spur the activity of the mitochondria and cause a number of active changes in terms of their number and multiple content. And it turns out such a situation that we will now take a few of the beginning of our discussion, but I have already mentioned that some people may overdo it with loads, which will go to the detriment of their professional and so on. So here with the pursuit of mitochondria, an absolutely situation can arise. Chasing an increased amount of mitochondria and increasing their functional activity, you can simply get to the point that, yes, you will get what you want, but you will not have any applied effect for your life. That is, you will use them when you perform high-intensity, high-volume loads. Because that's exactly what you have them for, and they will adapt accordingly, change, and so on. The question arises, do you need it for your life? You can set the quality of life simply with banal aerobic loads that you will perform a certain number of times a week, without chasing after such serious biochemical, bioenergetic changes in the body, which in principle are the lot of highly qualified athletes, because this is the subject of their professional argumentation and they should work especially correctly on these aspects. If we take two people who do not have an active life, they have a correspondingly smaller amount in the body. And we take, for example, an active person, and if by the duration of life, that is, whether any will play a role. That is, we remove all other environmental factors, health, and so on. If we take two absolutely identical people, compare the number of mitochondria. Is there any way this can affect the lifespan? This question is actually quite complicated for the simple reason that here we say we take two identical people. They are the same even in terms of the ratio of muscle fibers. Well, yes, roughly speaking, they do not understand if a person is engaged in physical education, which is engaged in physical education, most likely he was twins, absolutely the same. But one who does not play sports, yes, he sits there at the computer, works at home, does not move much. And the second is his brother, who, on the contrary, is engaged. Exercise. Maybe he has some classes during the week, yes, and he observes this one. But outwardly, of course, they may differ slightly in carts, in horse weight, yes. But in principle, if so, they are the same against the background. The question is actually somewhat provocative for the simple reason that here it is, this sedentary lifestyle and physical activity, it is still connected with the category of exploitation of the body. Doing physical activity, we cause a set of adaptations that allow us to adapt to the load, but before we adapt, we get energy costs that are quite large, which deplete our body. We get some kind of microtrauma, which the body also needs to restore, and so on. Behind it, we acquire these adaptive changes that can affect our health. That is, initially we still load our body, it's hard for him, he needs to cope with it somehow. And a similar situation is in principle typical for people who lead a sedentary lifestyle. Think about it, they are inactive, their body is little adapted to external influences, factors, and so on. And some ordinary things are also stressful for them. They also face the fact that, for example, it is difficult for them to climb to the 10th. In any case, they have a certain kind of stress, they have a certain kind of exhaustion and a number of subsequent chain biochemical, physiological changes, and so on. That is, we are all sedentary people or, let's say, athletes, physical education students are faced with the fact that every day, regardless of our preferences, we are faced with the fact that we load the body. And here we can say that someone will live longer, someone less, but I doubt to answer this question for the simple reason that everyone has some features of their own body, features of the same health, that is, they may be contraindicated in physical activity, because there are a group of diseases that are myogenic in nature, that is, they occur when a person performs a sufficiently intense physical activity and a number of other similar phenomena that do not allow us to say that physical culture or sports can somehow prolong life. Unfortunately, that is, here we need to take into account that it should be some kind of medical and biological examinations on an ongoing basis, some kind that will give him an expert opinion on whether it is advisable for this person to either have fun or prepare for his professional activity, or in order to diversify your way of life, to do so and so, and so and so. Maybe he doesn't need to do this at all, because history shows that there are a huge number of examples that people who have not been engaged in physical culture and sports, bad habits live long enough, and I don't know any. And on the other hand, the same applies to athletes. A huge number of people who have been engaged in physical culture, a huge number of those who have been engaged in sports, and professionally, also live long and well. It seems to me that this is a purely individual issue and I decided to go to it individually. Yes, I understand, but there is no direct answer, because there is probably no research in this direction. That is, this is probably not the most important component, yes, to evaluate and how to calculate life expectancy. The final question. If we are considering physical education and physical culture and sports, that is, for all the time of your training, activities, what would you highlight the main ones, for example, pros and cons, and where would you go if, for example, you had the word choice, but with this knowledge that you have, do you have any? You mean sports and physical culture to develop. That is, you understand, for example, what are the consequences, relatively speaking, of sports and physical culture. That is, you also chose in favor of which direction it was already received well. Based on my growing views on residence, for professional skills, and so on, would prefer permanent physical education, that is, I would determine for myself some areas that satisfy me in terms of emotions that I receive on the day of classes. Plus, they fit, so to speak, optimally in the context of my, say, body type. That is, they put this type of load on me, I can perform these loads accordingly, adapt to them, and again get a certain kind of pleasure from this. At the same time, I would not be limited to doing some kind of sport, but I would consider sports as some kind of direction for my physical development, because the very specifics of competitive activity, but well, we basically do some work functions every day, but we also have some elements of similar phenomena in ordinary life. Therefore, I would not consider any one sport activity for myself, I would simply try some new things for myself as a hobby, that is, try a dark number of sports, respectively. Some could hook me and I would use them in the future in order to implement these are training sessions, programs within the framework of their physical education, because when we talk about sports, we are talking about the fact that there are a huge number of options for performing various types of human motor activity. This is a huge amount of motor skills, skills that can be mastered. And the learning process with this new motor skill is also pleasant. You get pleasure from when you have learned to perform some new motor behaviors. Plus, from this you get a number of advantages that are directly associated with long-term human activity. That is, the benefits, the masses, but I would not consider any competitive elements for myself. I simply am not interested. Yes, I'm someone, for example, I wonder, they get an adrenaline drive, you know what I'm talking about. Let them, for example, do alternating sports. If you bring pleasure to a person and does not directly harm his health, then why not? And that's the question of sports if we digress. What kind of future do you see for sports? That is, we have already achieved very high performance in sports, yes, that is, well, if we considered, relatively speaking, pairs of the Olympics, yes, these technical aspects are used there to improve results, that is, other runners, other hands, prosthetics, let's say, more modern, can be done there. More powerful, then if we take sports, for example, yes, there is a running speed control, right? That is, 100 meters, there are 400 meters. That is, now, as it were, new records are almost very, very rarely set, because it's hard for us to surpass this threshold. That is, what do you think, after what time these results will no longer be able to be interrupted? Because, for example, we have ideally worked out the technology there, pharmacology is at its maximum, so to speak, peaks, and it can no longer be used at all. What is your opinion on this? That is, how much sport and in general he will live and his relevance in it, that's if in the competitive and indicators of new records. You have an interesting question at the very end. In short, everything basically rests on genetics. And genetics is not only in terms of the predisposition of one individual to a specific occupation, but genetics in the long term, because we still have human crossing, there is a certain kind of increase in offspring. And there are a lot of examples that indicate that, for example, a couple is created by a representative of weightlifting, they have a child, whom they begin to train the very, very, very small. No, at least to teach techniques to some other day actions and so on. And the person allegedly is already predisposed to this sport initially. Therefore, the records that exist now, perhaps some of them have already reached their maximum value, and in some sports there are still some options for the simple reason, perhaps the person who is most predisposed to this type of motor activity has not yet been born, because it is all genetically determined factors. That is, roughly speaking, we are connecting pharmacology and genetics, that is, genetic change. That is, rather, I have, so to speak, lovers of a certain type and they can do something in theory. In theory, yes. Yes, that's it, I understand. Thank you very much. Please. We were visiting Dmitry Ivanovich. Thank you all. See you soon.